So I'm going to talk very briefly about Zika planning from the local health department perspective. I want to talk about the planning context that we've been working in for the last several months. Also talk about some of the partners that we brought into the discussion. Talk about the communications plan that we've developed in order to make sure that as certain trigger events happen, that we've got communications ready to go out. And then I also want to spend some time talking about our surveillance efforts. We're also using Dr. Christopher Rogers with Kansas Biological Survey to do some work in Johnson County to try to assess what our local mosquito population looks like. So very briefly, Johnson County is in the southwest quadrant of the Kansas City metropolitan area. We have about 580,000 people currently. We have 20 municipalities within the county, and that's important because that means there are a lot of jurisdictional boundaries and there are a lot of different agencies involved in work that relates to Zika. We have 478 square miles, so it's a fairly large county. We have an extensive park and streamway system, and that's important because that puts people in proximity of places where mosquitoes breed. And so that's a big factor in some of the considerations about doing the surveillance. And then also we're a mix of urban, suburban, exurban, and rural land uses. So a lot of variety in Johnson County. So, and I know some of you are eating lunch right now, and if this picture has an adverse impact on that process, I apologize. But I wanted to talk about the planning context in terms of what we know, what we know we don't know, and then also the things that we don't know, because that's really important. This is a very dynamic situation. And you know, prior to mid-2015, I think none of us had probably heard of Zika. And yet here it is in mid-2016, and it's in the news every day. And the information that we're getting is changing every day. And we know that there's a lot of media attention, and so that has the potential to create a lot of public alarm about this disease. What we know we don't know is really the extent of the local vector presence. Charlie talked about the CDC maps that show that both Aedes aegypti and albopictus are present in the Kansas City area. So we wanted to really get a handle on what the extent of that presence is to determine what the risk is. The other unknowns is that we know 4 in 5 people who get the virus don't exhibit any symptoms. And so that makes it tricky to know exactly what the presence in the community might actually be. And then the other big question is, will or when will local transmission occur? I mean, we've seen in Florida that that's already happening. And presumably, if we have travelers coming back from the Olympics and other affected areas, we're going to have people in the Kansas City area who have the virus and may not know it. And then the unknown unknowns are the ones that always get you. We don't know what those are, but with this situation being as dynamic as it is, I think we're going to find out some things that we didn't know. Okay, so talking about our partners that we convened, we started with an internal planning group made up of several different county departments, including our own health and environment. We also had Parks and Recreation, Public Works, which manages our county stormwater program. We also had Emergency Management, the county manager's office, particularly their public information officer, and then K-State Extension. Rick Miller in the Olathe office has been a real asset to us in kind of getting a handle on some of the issues. We had 3 meetings starting in May, actually starting in April and going through May, to discuss some of the basics of the disease, kind of develop a common operating picture so that everybody knows what information we have and what we don't know. We also talked about occupational health issues because certainly local governments, they have people working in the field, Parks and Rec folks, Public Works folks, wastewater. So we wanted to make sure that we were addressing occupational health issues. And then communications planning and outreach is really a big deal because, again, anytime you have a public health matter come up, there's always the potential for people to become alarmed. And what we want to do is strike a balance between informing people but not unduly alarming them. And for some of the reasons that Charlie discussed earlier, there really isn't cause for alarm in the Kansas City region. We need to be vigilant, but we don't need to be alarmed. So moving on to our city partners, we hosted an informational meeting at the beginning of June to talk about what we know and to kind of, again, develop a common operating picture for our municipal partners. That's important because, again, they have staff working outdoors. They have residents who are going to be calling, City Hall to say, hey, do we have this virus in our area? What do we need to do? And so just to make sure that everybody has the information they need to be responsive to the questions. We had 60 participants in the meeting. We had a variety of different departments, which was really great to see. Codes enforcement is a big deal because to the extent that there may be some situations in neighborhoods where maybe somebody has a pool that hasn't been used, that can be a big breeding ground for mosquitoes. As a public health department, when we're contacted about issues like that, there's not a lot that we can do. We don't really have the authority to tell somebody what to do with their pool, but from a codes enforcement perspective, we can talk with our partners at the cities and elicit some action. So it's important to have those relationships in place. We also developed a communications plan. Again, this started in May and went through June. We've now got a plan that is very flexible, which it needs to be because, again, the situation is very dynamic. And then we've organized the plan into tiers based on certain trigger events. So those trigger events might include things like we've identified, local travel-related cases. If we identify local transmission, that would be another trigger for additional communications. And then if we were to identify a case of Zika-related microcephaly in Johnson County, that would be another trigger. So Charlie talked about some of the resources that are available. We do have resources for our ongoing emergency preparedness activities that we can use for some of this work. But there has been no federal appropriation specifically for Zika at this point. And so we don't have funding beyond our existing resources to do the work. We do rely heavily on CDC informational resources. For those of you who have been to the CDC website, there's a lot of great information out there, a lot of good public communications tools that we can tap into, and that's been a real asset. One thing that I noticed looking at the site this morning is that so much information is being added that things that used to be easily retrievable are now getting lost amid all the information that's being posted. But there's still great resources there, and I highly recommend going there to learn more about it. Again, we want to inform people without alarming them. That's really important. And then our communications plan also encourages personal action. So making sure that people know how to protect themselves, using repellent, wearing long-sleeve clothing, and then also taking steps around their residences to make sure that there aren't breeding grounds in the form of, gutters that are trapping water and bird feeders and that kind of thing, or bird baths. So I mentioned that we are starting to do some surveillance. We did that because the CDC maps indicated that we probably have both Aedes species in this area, but we don't have a good local picture of how that looks locally. We wanted to be able to assess the potential for local transmission, what is the actual vector presence, and then we also were able to identify some existing funding to sponsor a surveillance program. Now, I don't know if everybody's hearing that. There's some background noise if somebody can address that. So the scope of our project, we've got 4 locations in the county. One is in southern Overland Park, we have another in central Overland Park, one is in central Lenexa, and one is at Lake Quivira. The project started in mid-June, and it's going to be running through mid-October. Typically July, August, and September are kind of the high mosquito season. We are doing this on a bi-weekly basis, so setting traps at those 4 locations every 2 weeks. And then we are using 2 different types of traps, one for the Culex and one for the Aedes species. And I've got some pictures of those. So this is a Sentinel Trap, and this is one that's specifically targeted toward the Aedes aegypti and albopictus. These are mosquitoes that tend to fly low to the ground, and so this actually is placed on the ground. The hole in the top has a little fan that sucks in air, and so the large black housing, which is kind of hard to see in this picture, has some baits that are similar to like human breath and also human body odor. So as that fan is pulling air into the trap, it's also forcing out the air from the baits. And so that's attracting mosquitoes to the trap. And so as they approach the opening, the fan sucks them in. There's a little mesh pouch underneath that cylinder that pulls them in, and they stay trapped in there. So after a period of, these are usually set overnight. They can be set out for as long as 48 hours. But after some period, then the trap is retrieved and the mosquitoes are sampled. The other trap, which is really more for the Culex species, is called the CO2 beta trap. And so what this does, there's the large black cylinder on top is a receptacle for dry ice, which is the solid form of CO2. And as that solid sublimates to a gas, it attracts mosquitoes. The little black device hanging below the black cylinder, that's a battery pack under which there's a light. And then the light attracts mosquitoes to the opening of the trap. And again, the black cylinder below that little black box is a little fan that's pulling the mosquitoes into the trap. So that mesh pouch that you see hanging down is the pouch into which the mosquitoes are pulled. Now this has to be set overnight. So what they do is they go to the trapping site in the evening and fill the container with ice and then leave it overnight. The following morning they go and retrieve the mesh bag with the mosquitoes in it. We are not doing any surveillance for mosquito larvae at this point. That's something that if we get additional funding down the road, we might be able to do. But again, our focus at this point is really just to assess the adult population and see what we have so far. So we have sampled 4 times at each of these 4 locations. As of the most recent sample, which was collected July 28, we have found Aedes albopictus in all 4 locations. Now that's kind of new because prior to the 28th, we really weren't seeing great numbers of Aedes albopictus. But this last time, whereas we caught about 6 mosquitoes on the 14th, as of July 28th, we had seen about 63 Aedes albopictus across the 4 locations. So we do know that the population of the mosquito is growing. Part of that may be due to the natural cycle where populations increase over summer. We also had a very wet July. You may recall that June was fairly dry, and so that's not really conducive to mosquito breeding. But July was wet, and so we believe that helped increase the population, resulting in the higher numbers in the July 28 samples. So in response to that, we issued a media release yesterday to, again, remind people that they need to be taking action to protect themselves by wearing repellent and being careful when they go outside. So looking forward, we are going to continue monitoring local, regional, and national events, as we all are, continuing to keep our partners apprised of our work and also keep the public apprised of what's going on. And then also look for resources to continue our surveillance efforts. Again, we know that one of the vectors, it's the less competent vector, but nonetheless we have it present here in the region. So people do need to be vigilant about that. But again, we don't feel that there's a big cause for alarm because the Aedes albopictus is as happy to get a blood meal from your dog or your cat as it is from you. So, and from other mammals that are in the wild, so raccoons, opossums, etc. So because that mosquito is sort of a more opportunistic feeder, we're not as concerned as we would be if we had the Aedes aegypti present in the Kansas City area. Now, that's not to say the picture couldn't change in the future, of course. I mean, we're going to continue the monitoring, and it's possible at some point we might see the aegypti here in our region. Currently, that's not the case. So, with that, I will turn it over to our moderator and entertain questions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Charlie and James, for this very informative and timely talk. We're going to check online to see if there are any questions from the chat box, but in the meantime, we'll take some questions from here in the room if there are any.
With the traps that you have set and the species that you've caught, obviously you're determining what the species of the mosquito is, but are there tests, or do you do tests to see if that particular mosquito is infected with Zika? Like if you started to see the Aedes aegypti species are you able to test those particular insects?
That's a really great question, and just in case somebody didn't hear it, the question is, are we testing the mosquitoes that we trap to see if they're actually carrying the Zika virus? The answer to that question is no, because that goes beyond the scope of what we were able to afford. Certainly in other areas in Florida, they are doing that kind of testing. We don't currently have the resources to do that. So all we know is that the species is present. We don't know if they're actually carrying the virus.
So I have two questions. One is, where are the traps located? And the second one is, what has happened in Florida that they're not controlling it?
Okay.
Charlie mentioned that they weren't too successful
So
in their spraying. What are they doing?
I'm going to defer the second question to Charlie, and Charlie, I'll repeat that for you. In regard to the first question, Dr. Neuberger asked where the traps in Johnson County are located. Very generally speaking, one is at the Overland Park Arboretum. Another location is at Central Overland Park, which is around 127th and Knoll. We have one in Central Lenexa, and then we also have one at Lake Quivira. So different locations around the county where people are likely to be in mosquito breeding habitats.
Only have four.
Only 4 locations, that's correct. And that was what we were able to afford with our existing resources. Charlie, the other question that Dr. Neuberger had was what is happening in Florida that the county or the state is not able to control the mosquito species there.
Sure. And what Dr. Fried mentioned yesterday during the media telebriefing was that there may be several reasons. One is that the mosquitoes may be resistant to the insecticides that are being applied. My understanding is that they are in the process of testing for resistance, but that's one of the reasons. The other reason he mentioned was cryptic breeding areas. Again, these mosquitoes can breed in very small amounts of water, small containers and so forth. And with aerial spraying in particular, it's hard to reach and may be ineffective for getting at the mosquito larvae. And then again, just is typically a difficult mosquito to control. And as I mentioned, there was a shift. That was new information that came in over the weekend that prompted CDC in Florida to change their travel recommendations.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions from the chat box. One is treatment just supportive care? What is the length of the symptoms with this virus?
This is Charlie. Yes, the treatment is supportive care, and typically the symptoms will last a few days to up to a week.
And then our next question, if a girl or woman is infected with Zika but is not pregnant, then becomes pregnant later in life, is there potential for the virus to reactivate and potentially cause birth defects in her child?
And this is Charlie, and that has not been mentioned as a concern. So again, there is a recommendation generally after exposure to weight, 8 weeks before becoming pregnant if the person's been in an area. But there's not been any recommendation that I've seen or concerns about much later in life.